This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. Welcome to the continuation of the discussion on Anti-Capitalist Chronicles about the performance of the capitalist class and who constitutes the capitalist class. I think that it's important to recognize that there's a big difference within the capitalist class between those who are there by virtue of inheritance and those who are there by virtue of entrepreneurial activity and the Jeff Bezos of this world and the Gates of this world. The Rockefellers and the Walmart, Walton family and so on are all about inheritance. And inheritance is kind of interesting because some of the people who do the inheriting and do things in a different kind of way. For instance, the constant saga within the Murdoch family between Lachlan Murdoch and James Murdoch, the two sons, and James Murdoch has taken climate change very seriously, which of course Fox News does not. So there is a wealth coming out of there which is divided. But to what degree is the capitalist class coherent? And this plays into a situation right now where it is incoherent in terms of what it does with its money. It's sort of arbitrary and a lot of it is in whims, but generally speaking, it uses its money to control in ways that its own particular whims determine. For instance, Bloomberg is very progressive about gun violence and climate change. But if you talk in his presence about labor rights or anything of that kind, forget it. So one of the things we have to do is to recognize that the ruling class is very divided in terms of how it should use its philanthropic power and what it should use it for. But it is extremely consolidated when it comes to the protection of the nature of that capitalist world that allows them to accumulate wealth in the way they do. In other words, they really see themselves as guardians of class system. Now, the guardians of a class system are radically different from the sort of legal structure. There's a dissonance, if you like, a real dissonance between what they do with their money and how they get their money. How they get their money is they get their money by any sometimes crooked way at all. So, but then we have to deal with their relationships with the rest of society and how the rest of society actually tolerates what it is they do. To some degree, they are tolerated because we are not subject to great awareness. And in this, the liberal media is as guilty as the rest, which is the liberal media disguises, does not want to deal with even the structure of the media. The structure of the media is a problem because the media is controlled by that ruling class. And not only is the media controlled, but a lot of areas of cultural activity are also controlled. Those areas of cultural activity can include, doing documentaries on Netflix, which are very uncomplimentary and reveal things about what the ruling class has done and all the rest of it. So, it's a bit of self-flagellation within the ruling class, which I think is, par for the course. But the other problem I think we need to look at is the organization of labor. And again, I'm going to go back and talk about some of the things that I've talked about before. The nature of the working class has been transformed radically since the 1970s. And I think we have to come to terms with this and understand what this is about. The first proposition I have is this. Again, this goes back to something I've said before. In a situation where there's a falling rate of profit, there will be a compensatory movement searching to employ more labor. The reason for that is because capitalists are interested in the maximization of wealth. And maximization of wealth becomes much easier when you have wealth. And there's a rule here which I think we've again come across before, when Marx kind of says that a small capital with a large rate of return, a strong rate of return, is far less valuable than a large capital with a low rate of return. There's a saying in the capitalist class, which is the difficult thing for the capitalist class is raising the first million, getting the first billion. Once you've got the first billion, you can get another billion easily on top of that, no problem whatsoever. I mean, consider, for example, a simple kind of very conservative investment. Suppose you've got $1 million to invest and you put it in municipal bonds or something like that, and you get 4%. Okay, so you get $40,000 at the end of the year. Well, with $1 million investment, you can get $40,000 income, tax-free, and you could imagine kind of living on that. But imagine with $100 million invested in tax-free bonds, and then you're talking about $400,000 tax-free. Now, you can do a lot with $400,000 tax-free. And this is the point about the rising mass. The more you have, the easier it is to get more. And there is a certain psychology that goes with this, which actually is interesting, given Marx's comment that the psychology tends to follow the material experience, that to the degree that you can get more because you've got more means that you want more. And the capitalist class seems not to be satisfied at all with, $1 billion. It wants $2 billion. It wants $20 billion. I mean, this is the way they think and work. So first off, therefore, it is really very easy for capitalists to accumulate who've already accumulated. And the more you've accumulated, the easier it is to accumulate more, because you don't really care about getting a maximum rate of return of 20% or 30%. You can get by on 4% on municipal bonds. I mean, that's very, very conservative, of course, and most capitalists would not be crazy enough just to do that. So there is the situation where, yes, it is easier and easier and easier for centralized capital to become more centralized. Furthermore, the centralization process is itself a main vehicle for accumulation of wealth. For example, Wall Street investment banks, where do they make their money? They mainly make their money out of initial public offerings, IPOs. They make their money out of mergers and acquisitions. Those are the two areas. Now, when China bans Chinese companies from doing IPOs on Wall Street, it's really cutting into a major source of revenue for the very rich folk in Wall Street. So this is a real blow to Wall Street. And of course, they're doing it because the Chinese want to control their own billionaire class, and they own their own large companies. So this habit of accumulating wealth on the back of wealth, and what you find with the billionaire class is they start off doing one thing, and then they start to branch out and do all kinds of other things too. So pretty soon they're monopolizing everything in society. So we've got a monopoly kind of situation emerging in which the billionaires are increasingly determining everything. So here is how, for example, as the pandemic unfolds, we're likely to find an increasing concentration of wealth in just one sector of the economy. In much of the United States, the rental market is divided between large-scale producers of rental housing and leasing of large condominiums and the like, that sort of world. But a large proportion of the rental market in the United States is occupied by part-time owners. The part-time owners it often is a legacy. Somebody inherits a property which they don't want to live in, so they rent it out and they become a renter. And those private renters maybe will have 2 units or two or three very small operations. But the rental income is terribly important for them. It can often help sustain the fact that their wages are relatively low and they have relatively low remuneration. School teachers or something like that, but they can rent. They have a couple of apartments which they're renting out, and they get a little income from that, or cover their mortgage payments through it, or the like. So there's quite a large segment of rental housing in the United States which is that sort. Now, during the pandemic, many of the people who were renting could not afford to pay the rent. They could not be evicted. So those people who relied upon that form of income from those couldn't get it. So they were denied their income. Now, we're coming out of the pandemic. At the moment, there is still the moratorium on evictions in many parts of the world, and it's been extended to some degree till September. But at some point or other, it's going to come into play, and in which case we're likely to see a large number of evictions of tenants who have not paid their rent for 6 months or a year. And we're all going to see evictions of many of the mortgage players who owe back mortgage but can't pay it. So we're going to see quite a lot of evictions, and we're going to see a lot of properties coming onto the market. And right now, a lot of the small owners are already beginning to bail out, selling out. I mean, one of the ways they can deal with the situation is to sell their property. So there is a market emerging of rental properties for sale, and a market beginning to emerge, or which will emerge as the mortgage payment problems start to become very serious. Now, what's going to happen? Well, what happened in 2010, 2008 was a lot of banks foreclosed upon housing. They sat there with housing on their hands. Who took the housing off their hands? Well, one big organization, Blackstone, took housing off their hands. Blackstone is now one of the largest property owners in the world, and is certainly the largest property owner in the United States. Blackstone will almost certainly come in and just gobble up all of those properties. It will do so by borrowing money against the value of those properties, and it will do so by leveraging, and it will become almost a monopoly controller of the rental market in the United States and the leasehold market in the United States. Now, this is monopoly control. Now, who runs Blackstone? Stephen Schwarzman runs Blackstone. He is the single person who is actually. So what does Stephen Schwarzman do? Stephen Schwarzman supports Donald Trump. Stephen Schwarzman is a big donor to our MIT and I think Oxford University. For what? To stabilize the education of the humanities. Now, isn't that nice? Isn't that nice? He's going to help Harvard or MIT educate people in humanities and humanitarian values and all those of it. And you think to yourself, this is actually money which is going to be at the expense of the huge losses in the market. And it will set up scholarships for deserving persons and the like of it, like in Oxford and in MIT. And I have this fantasy of what will happen. There's somebody whose parents lost their property to Blackstone. That somebody there will become a deserving, indigent scholar who will be given a scholarship to go to MIT or Oxford to study the humanities on the back of the wealth, the huge wealth that Stephen Schwarzman has already assembled in terms of running Blackstone. At the same time, as I mentioned, Stephen Schwarzman is a great supporter of Donald Trump. Donald Trump needs some money. Stephen Schwarzman, give it to him. Peter Galangone, Donald Trump wants money. Give it to him. These are the people who are supporting Donald Trump, not because they think he's sensible or he makes good policy or anything of that kind, but because he shields them from consideration. He's a useful idiot, as they say, a useful idiot to the point where they are concerned to preserve their capacity to continue to make money massively. Right now, Blackstone is in a position, it has so many properties, it is in a position to raise billions of dollars on the market to mop up all of those properties which are coming onto the market. California will probably be monopolized soon in terms of rental properties, in terms of Blackstone. And it's not only in the United States. I have colleagues in Barcelona who are fighting like crazy with Blackstone in Barcelona because of the kinds of things it's doing in terms of mopping up. And here's the interesting thing. At this point, I would say, well, maybe they monopolized to such a degree that one of the ways in which we could actually create affordable housing in the United States would be to nationalize Blackstone. And then we could start to take all of those properties, instead of them being renting out at $3,000 to $4,000 a month or something like that, we rent them out at $1,000 a month and set up something of that kind. In other words, the affordable housing problem could be taken care of simply by nationalizing Blackstone and taking over Blackstone's properties. That's never going to happen, of course, and because it's unconstitutional. The Supreme Court won't allow it, and all kinds of other things will happen of that sort. And we know perfectly well, ideologically, that is kind of authoritarian socialism in the public eye, and so it won't happen. But my point here is this: that when we look at the way in which the accumulation of wealth and power is occurring within the capitalist class right now, what we see are increasing monopoly power. And here it also is the interesting thing. The neoliberal theory is supposed to be about individualism and competition, but in practice, it's long been about monopoly power. It's still about monopoly power, and it's increasing monopoly power and centralization. Mergers and acquisitions, which were on hold during the pandemic, are suddenly picking up very fast. Mergers and acquisitions and the swallowing up of assets and land grabbing and house grabbing and everything else. We will soon be in a totally monopolized society in which the oligarchy will control the media, will control housing, will control the means of distribution, will control big pharma and all the rest of it. So this is the world we're moving into. And it is a world which is actually destined, it seems to me, to run up against some very, very serious barriers and problems. What are these major barriers? One of the things that Marx points out in Capital, and particularly in the Grundrisse, is that the continuous expansion of capital accumulation rests upon a continuous expansion of population. That is, it rests on population. Now, most people don't take seriously Marx's propositions about population growth and accumulation. And he doesn't press it very far. He just assumes that population growth is going to do whatever has to be done. Because population growth provides the excess population. It provides the excess labor. It also provides the extra demand. So even though the demand is weak, if you have a strong population growth, a lot of people making a little demand is still a substantial market. As somebody kind of said, look, there's a lot of wealth at the bottom of the pyramid. I mean, if there are 2 billion people living on $2 a day, that's still of a huge market. So we've got to colonize that market. So that market is growing. And to the degree that market grows and it's supplying labor and continuing to supply labor, then labor is going to be cheaper because there's a supply of labor. Now, the problem here is the demographics. The demographics show that many areas of the world are at zero population growth. Japan has been there for some time. Italy has been there for some time. Many European countries are there, actually. In fact, 50 countries in the world right now have either minimal or zero population growth rates, which means that one of the major pillars to the accumulation of capital is heading into a crisis, and it's getting worse very fast. Even India, which has a very large population growth, is declining in the rate of growth. China implemented in 1980 or so its one-child policy. The result is that population growth in China has stymied. The Chinese suddenly realized that the surplus population, which has been the source of their competitive advantage globally, the surplus population is disappearing. They were there in 1980, but they're now retired. And China's got an aging population and a smaller and smaller population base for its economy. So what does China do? It abandons the one-child policy and says, hey, you can have 2 kids. Then it's just recently, it found no effect. Just recently it said, hey, you can have 3 kids. So China's going into a pro-natalist policy because it realizes that it needs the population to continue its growth. Unless, of course, it switches the kind of economy it's developing into a kind of capital-intensive economy rather than a labor-intensive economy. And there are signs of that happening. Part of what Xi has been doing is saying the Chinese economy has to be reoriented to capital intensity rather than labor intensity. And the idea is that by 2025, that the economy will be more and more capital intensive. So that the Chinese case is an interesting one. So one of the big barriers is going to be that. The second, and committed to that, is also the problem that many countries which have a deficit of population and don't have sufficient population are plagued by anti-immigrant fervor. Immigration into Japan, forget it. Immigration into Italy, increasing, yes, it's there, but a lot of barriers. Donald Trump, anti-immigration. So the more anti-immigration fervor you get, and populations trying to protect themselves from immigrants are actually doing it in a way that is likely to lead to slower growth. There is an interesting correlation between those countries which have bad demographic conditions and low rates of economic growth. And increasingly, barriers to population movement and barriers to immigration are going to play a very crucial role. So that's one of the things. But the enormous increase that occurred in the global wage labor force after 1980 or so was not resting upon demographics of this sort. It was largely resting on the fact that there were large areas of the world that had not yet been incorporated into the wage labor market. The whole of the communist world, Russia, China, Eastern Europe, was outside of global wage labor. They have come into the market since 1980. They've added hugely to the global wage labor force. Hugely. The second thing is that peasant societies, self-sustaining peasant societies, have been under assault for 100 years now. But there are still large remnants of it left. I mean, much of what happened in China was a peasant world, which was an agrarian peasant world, which was turned into factory labor. There's a lot going on in India that way, in Indonesia. So we've got a lot of collapse of the final versions, vestiges of peasant economies, which are alternative economies. There is still one area of the world where none of this has happened, and that's largely Africa. Africa is still the great labor reserve. But Africa is just Africa, and Africa is still increasing rapidly in population. Nigeria threatens to be one of the largest populations in the world if demographic trends continue within 50 years. So that was a source. The other source, interestingly, was the incorporation of women into the labor force. The incorporation of women was very reluctant post-World War II. But it has essentially become, even in the major economies. But again, all of those have been exhausted. What the communist world has come in, the peasant stuff is now pretty much played out. insofar as women are playing the background of wage labor, you have the feminization of wage labor and the feminization of poverty. That has occurred. And the demographics. So, by and large, labor supply conditions are going to tighten, whether you like it or not, over the next 10, 15 years. And those tightening labor conditions are going to mean that capital has less room to expand. So its expansionism is going to be corralled, if you like, by demographic and labor scarcity problems. This is something which is going to be very critical for capital accumulation. Can capital accumulation continue with zero population growth, zero migration? That is the kind of question. And my answer to that is no, it cannot. So the closer we get to zero on those features, then the closer we get to a situation in which capital accumulation is going to become more and more difficult unless capital starts to cannibalize itself. Now, to some degree, it already is cannibalizing itself. That is, small producers are being gobbled up by large producers. And what we see in the housing market is a monopolization of the rental market as opposed to. So it may be that there will be monopolization, and monopolization will stabilize the situation in the face of these kinds of scarcity. But there are very serious barriers to the continuity of capital accumulation for the future. But then there is, then of course, the whole kind of problem of the degree of organization of the labor force. To the degree that that labor force becomes organized, starts to demand an alternative way of living and a decent house and a decent living environment with decent income conditions, those demands, the degree to which alienated populations are going to rise up and start to challenge the existing system. Because now we've got a situation. Here, I think, is the closing point of this. Here we have a situation in which most people recognize that the economy as it's presently constituted does not work to the benefit of the mass of the population. There is therefore considerable alienation from this form of economy and a requirement for an urge to look for something different. Secondly, there is considerable alienation from politics. Most people, and I talk about not only on the right, I talk about on the left, would argue that the political system does not work to the benefit of the population. It is not government by the people for the people. It is government by a political elite, which is for the political elite in association with the elite capitalist class. Everybody has that picture of that is the world in which they are. Now, the response to that is, craziness on the left, craziness on the right, all kinds of things are responding to that. But that is the core problem. And the core problem is going to have to be addressed, particularly in the condition of this constraint of lack of capacity to expand, which, of course, is also paralleled by the difficulty of continuing expansion in the way that we've been doing in the relationship to environmental concerns and environmental conditions. In other words, we are moving right at this point into a situation of monopolization, a situation of monopolization of power, a monopolization of class power. And that monopolization is going to have to deal with the fact that almost everybody is saying the economy is not working for me, politics is not working for me, we have to have an alternative. I don't care what it is, give me any old thing. Anything is better than what we've got. This anti-elite feeling, which exists on both left and right, and all the rest of it, those kinds of questions are going to be very much upon the agenda. This is, if you like, where we are right now. We've got here neoliberalism is not dead if we interpret neoliberalism as a concentration and centralization of capitalist class power. Neoliberalism is alive and well in that sense, but its ideological configuration, the ideas which support it, are plainly wrong in relationship to the experience, which takes me back, at some point or other, the ruling ideas are accountable to the nature of the experiences. And the experiences now are radically at odds with the ruling ideas. And therefore, there's a crisis of ideology, a crisis of economy, and a crisis in the environment, and a crisis of the future in terms of demographic possibilities. That is where we are currently at.
Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.